Thanks very much, Professor Nemenzo. Thank you to the Third World Center for this kind invitation. It's, of course, one can't feel a bit nostalgic having been here in UP and having spent a lot of time in the Third World Center more than 25 years ago. I should add that at the time I was 8, so I'm the youngest. I was indeed at the PPSA, very interesting meeting in Batak, and to repeat the line that I said there, the book, The Anti-Marcos Struggle, was retitled for an Ilocano edition, Marcos Okay Lang. What I want to do today is say a lot of things all of you already know, which doesn't seem like a very exciting proposition, except perhaps to offer a rather skeptical spin on things. Although, given the fact that the president apparently is on campus at the same time, should he step into the room, I will immediately change my lines. So what I'd like to do is walk through some familiar aspects of the administration, perhaps put together in a slightly different way, and also using a theoretical perspective that's sometimes referred to as political time, in which the sequencing of presidents is not just viewed chronologically, but also relationally. And in particular, I think the relationship between Aquino and Arroyo, and between Aquino, Arroyo, and Estrada is of great significance. And of course, the relationship between Aquino and Aquino, between the son and the mother. So I'll be referring to some of that as a little bit of a theoretical background, but I will be talking about a lot of the contemporary events, and I look forward to the discussion. If it's okay, I'll talk for about 45 minutes. That's not too long. Actually, for me, that's a short period, so I'll try to contain myself. Anyway, it's very nice to be here and look forward to this discussion. Let me start off by saying that as an observer, what is striking is the manipulation, or to put more neutrally, the politics of symbols, the symbolic nature of this regime. And they've come up with a number of catchy phrases, which I put on the PowerPoint, that all of you are familiar with. And these things alone don't seem particularly impressive. They seem like, you know, a series of rhetorical flourishes, gestures, eating hot dogs rather than fancy dinners in New York. I think more significant still is Aquino actually hosting an anti-corruption convention and sort of presenting himself as the best example of an effective leader combating corruption, endemic corruption, finally dealing with an age-old problem. So I think one of the interesting things is the way those symbols have been used, and apparently to great effect. I think if we look at the opinion polls, based on what I'm going to say after this, it's hard to understand why this president is so popular unless you realize that he has been successful in the politics of symbolism. Because the question of reform, and I'm going to argue that this is a reformist president, not a president who necessarily undertakes much reform, but a reformist president in terms of the narrative. If you just take a brief look at what this president has accomplished or has not accomplished, it's a rather different picture altogether. Just to take some of the promises or claims the administration makes and compare it to what actually has occurred. One of the things that the current administration has always put in the forefront of its tasks is an infrastructural offensive in a number of different areas. The evidence is that the now almost first 3 years of the Aquino administration has not been particularly successful, even compared to the predecessor. In fact, particularly compared to the predecessor. There was a bit of a bottleneck in 2011 in particular. The administration, of course, will argue they're preparing for the real offensive, which will be in the second half of this term. That's, of course, one thing that it is only halfway through. So one argument will be, of course, Aquino has been preparing the groundwork for what will be a very successful second part of his presidency. But I'm taking a look at the first part, and I think even in terms of infrastructure, the outcome has been more limited than certainly what was promised. While it's true that there have been no major national scandals, at least any that have come out in the open yet, which is one question the difference between scandals that are going on and those that we actually know about. I think there's no doubt that in a number of areas, syndicates continue to thrive. So the question is, even if Aquino has avoided the kind of embarrassing scandals that plagued the Arroyo administration after 2004, there is little evidence that I see anyway that there's been a systematic effort to combat syndicates at various levels of Philippine society. Not that that's particularly easy, but I don't even see the plan to do that. One area in particular I think deserves mention, and that is smuggling. One could argue, of course, this is chronic. You can't expect the Aquino government to end this overnight, but if you believe what some of Aquino's own allies are saying, in terms of oil smuggling, rice smuggling, steel smuggling, and many other things, then the problem is endemic, and if it's gotten better, then only very, very marginally. And of course, there's discussion what's going to happen to customs and whether the customs office is any better than previous administrations. You know, that's something we can discuss, and it's probably impossible to know for sure, but there's little doubt that when Aquino's own allies are complaining, there's something rotten in the state of customs in the Philippines. Yes, RH passed, and assuming that it is actually implemented, despite the Supreme Court's worries about it, and against very strong church hierarchy opposition, there are other important bills such as FOI that have not yet come through. Again, something we can see, but I think without doubt RH stands as a major accomplishment if it actually is implemented. Sin tax would be another example of a concrete reform. Special interests seem to be very strong. There have been previous efforts to pass such legislation. They were unsuccessful. So that surely has to count in Aquino's column. But overall revenue collection has been stagnating despite the best efforts to scare taxpayers into actually would-be taxpayers or should be taxpayers into actually paying. There's yet to be a conviction in this administration. Again, people will say, well, it just takes a long time in the courts, but it's telling that as of now we have no convictions. The fight against poverty, the ramping up of CCT, again, that's something the administration will tout as a major accomplishment. Interestingly, however, self-rated poverty remains stubbornly high. We'll have to see how the newest government-measured poverty figures come in later this year. But I think everybody will be very surprised if they show any significant drop in overall poverty in the Philippines. Nonetheless, we seem to be having more fun in the Philippines, not just in terms of the tourist slogan, but in terms of the Aquino administration. One thing, again, speaking as an observer, it's striking the change in mood, the emotional aspect of this. There is this spirit of optimism, and I would maybe categorize it in the following way. On the one hand, you have capitalists rebranded. The business community, at least those I've spoken to, and excepting those who are worried about smuggling, seem to be sold on the reform orientation of the administration. Another seeming vote of confidence is the hot money inflows, although that has a lot to do with the fact that the developed economies of the world are stagnating, have low interest rates, and places like the Philippines become particularly attractive for hot inflows. An interesting example now is Japan, with the depreciation of the yen and the appreciation of the peso makes the Philippine stock market and other such investments seem rather promising. By the way, this is, of course, as we know from past experience, and other places around the world, not necessarily a good thing in the long run. Possibly a warning signal that this could overheat the market, particularly if you look at the stock market recently. And to skip down to the bottom, it's not just a domestic audience that's been convinced, that's become more optimistic, it's an international one. Beginning with Transparency International, which is probably one of the worst methodologies of any social scientific outfit or so-called social scientific outfit. We will ask people what they think is going on with corruption. We will not actually study the subject with any great seriousness, but the way these things work these days, transparency gets a lot of media play. And so, based on what they're told by their Filipino informants, they're now telling the world that corruption is actually declining in the Philippines. S&P's rating, but now Fitch is the most discussed improvement in the Philippine investment grade rating. Philippines is being talked about as a new economic miracle. It's now a world leader in call centers, tourism is up. Demographics, this is fascinating. Now as RH is being passed, people are being told, after all, it was good that population explosion occurred. This is a positive signal for the U.S., for the Philippines, because of the potential for a larger labor force. Interesting how something that's been viewed negatively for so many years is also pitched as something positive. There's this interesting book by a Morgan Stanley analyst. Morgan Stanley seems to be the place where all the newest jargon is coined, BRICS and the rest of it. Now we're told that there are breakout nations, and one of them is, according to Sharma, the Philippines. So it's being talked up in that way as well. So clearly, the discourse about the Philippines is changing. The country's being rebranded, and that is also affecting at least people's views in the middle class and the elite in the Philippines, it seems. As I mentioned, when we think about the Aquino presidency, I think it's useful, or one useful way to talk about it is in terms of its relationship to other presidencies. Let me just offer a brief summary of a political scientist by the name of Stephen Skronik, who studied the U.S. presidency. And his analysis of the U.S. as a presidential system, I think, is relevant in some ways to the Philippines, although it needs to be adapted. There are important differences, obviously. He argues that performance of a president, if you try to ask yourself, how is a president performing? You can't really answer that question without talking about the relationship of that president to previous presidents. And that relationship is determined by what Skronik calls a regime. A regime is a constellation of interests, institutions, and ideologies. You have particular groups supporting a president. You have particular institutions that are aligned with that presidency and the presidents who follow on to a foundationalist president, as he calls it. And you have a particular set of ideologies which are important. So in the U.S. context, he argues, and I think quite convincingly, we're still in the political time of the Reagan regime. Ronald Reagan still determines the politics of the Philippines, which may seem surprising given that we now have an Obama presidency, that previously we had a Clinton presidency. In Skronik's terms, these are preemptive presidents. They do not confront the Reagan legacy directly. You do not see Obama going around and saying, actually, we need big government. He still admits that government needs to be lean and mean and efficient, but perhaps just a little add-on here and there, including a rather moderate health care plan, that even that is very controversial. You still have a Reagan legacy in foreign policy. I don't see Obama being much more peaceful in regard to the anti-terrorist campaign, which is, in a sense, a carryover of the old Cold War ideology. The drone attacks have actually increased under Obama. So both in terms of domestic and foreign policy, the kind of things Reagan discussed in terms of a hardline foreign policy on the one hand, and on the other hand, small government and such related aspects, they continue to dominate. And the regime of George Bush, the presidency of George Bush was very much a part of this regime. And Obama, although obviously on the other side, can only try to preempt it, he can't actually openly oppose it. And one question I've had is whether Obama will be successful enough to actually change the agenda. And even though he's been reelected, he faces a very hostile lower house in Congress. And I don't see him actually realigning interests. He still faces institutional obstacles in terms of the Supreme Court, of course, another legacy of the Reagan era and so on. I mean, I could go on about American politics, but the point is that if we think about it that way, then we have to understand that American presidents since Reagan have been very much influenced by his legacy. In the Philippine context, just to mention this briefly, interests are actually more easily identifiable, I would argue. In the U.S. context, you have a somewhat more diffuse power elite, to use the Millsian terminology, which is a little bit harder to pin down. The Philippines will argue that there are clear strategic groups we can talk about. The institutional arrangement is similar to the U.S. because of the fact it's a presidential system, but different in the sense that the actual powers of the presidency are greater, particularly the budgetary discretionary powers. But of course, the institutions are more fragile. At least two presidents have faced major challenges. In fact, they're lucky to have survived. Aquino, Aquino, and Arroyo. And of course, Estrada didn't survive. He was toppled by what I would describe very unpolemically as a people power putsch. He was toppled in a coup which was preempted by civilian insurrections. So you have a certain amount of institutional fragility in the Philippine context. Ideology is, of course, something that people tend to think is foreign to mainstream Philippine politics. I would argue that what you see in the Philippines are narratives that are very important in presidential campaigns, and they serve as the kind of scripts for presidents once they get in power. This is all a bit abstract. I'll hopefully make it a bit more concrete as I go on. So my overall argument about the current presidency of Aquino would be that he is part of this reformist regime, which has a reformist narrative. And again, to clarify, it's the claim to be committed to reform. That's what I'm interested in. Whether reforms are actually being taking place in a significant sense is another question. But the whole discourse is about reform, good governance, cleaning up a corrupt administration, putting the Philippines on a straight path, and so on and so forth. So this reformist narrative was created, actually I should say there are strong precedents for this reformist narrative in the pre-martial law Philippine context. Every opposition campaign was based on anti-corruption, but it was strengthened and systematized during the opposition to Marcos. And of course, the extreme predation of the late Marcos regime was the perfect context in which to create this. Not only that, though, they had a martyr. They had Ninoy Aquino as the martyr to say, we're willing to die for this cause of cleaning up the Philippines. So the argument would be, in Skronik's terms, that the founder of the current regime was Cory Aquino. The toppling of Marcos, the foundation of the new regime, writing a new constitution. And when I say a reformist regime, I'm talking about a narrative, but I'm also talking about certain interests. I'm talking about also continuity in personnel. The number of people who served in the Cory Aquino regime, who served in Ramos's regime, probably didn't serve in Estrada's regime, but are now back in Aquino's regime. So that's another aspect which I perhaps can discuss more later. So in these terms, Ramos would be an orthodox innovator, somebody who develops the reformist ideas of the Aquino administration. Some people would suggest he was much more successful in actually implementing reform. Estrada, by contrast, was a preemptive president. He didn't use the reformist narrative. He used something quite different, which I like to call populist, a pro-poor discourse. And for his efforts, he was overthrown in a people power coup. One interesting thing, of course, is how was he overthrown? He was overthrown because he was accused of corruption. The focus was on his misbehavior, on his the mansions he built for his mistresses and so on. I think that was a secondary issue, actually, to the concern about his change in this reformist discourse. But that was very, very much used. So they used the reformist narrative against him and actually overthrown. And the strategic groups that were most important were an alliance of the church, big business, civil society activists, and in conversation with Professor Nemenzo, I would add the military, which I'll talk about a little bit more later. That these groups worked together, obviously, in overthrowing Estrada, who was still very popular. His popularity ratings didn't decline significantly after his overthrow, even after being convicted of corruption, and with virtually no campaign machinery, he still came in second in the 2010 campaign. So that's the background of the rise of the second Aquino administration. We need to, of course, add the Arroyo presidency, who had tried to use a reformist script, tried to use a reformist narrative, but in fighting first Estrada and then, of course, FPJ, who was an even more popular active politician in 2004, she became an apostate of reform. She was seen as somebody who betrayed the legacy, the reformist legacy. Because of the rigged polls exposed by Hello Garcia, although actually it was obvious earlier, but it was only in Hello Garcia that this really was widely accepted as what happened in 2004. And of course the obvious rent-seeking, the corruption scandals. What you saw was a divided elite. She still had strong support from the church, from parts of big business and was able to co-opt the military, even if she faced very vehement opposition from many civil society activists. Noinoi, by contrast, is a good dynast. Dodo mentioned that I'm working on a project about dynasties in comparative perspective. One thing that's striking across the world is dynasties are seen as a bad thing. If you have dynasties, you feel bad about it. And this is not just true in the Philippines, it's true in India and even Japan. The Japanese are engaged in hand-wringing at every election. Look at all the dynasts we just elected. But one tends to forget there are also good dynasts, and Aquino was a good dynast somehow. That's a positive legacy. Remember how he campaigned with the picture of his father and mother in the background. Somehow that was a good thing, because that means we could trust him. Because they were reliable, he's also reliable. So that's one thing that perhaps we need to add to our understanding of dynasties, that they're not necessarily negative. Maybe they're negative in the abstract, but sometimes concretely they can be a great advantage, as Aquino showed in 2010. After all, his candidacy was only possible because of his mother's death. The fact that this mourning was so widespread, he was able to inherit the charisma of his mother's reformism, saintliness. So the reformist narrative was restored, and so was the regime elite trinity, if I'm maybe allowed to say it in those somewhat sacrilegious terms, of business, church, civil society, as well as the military. Just to reemphasize, Arroyo was very much the foil in this process. I don't think the current administration is at all intelligible in terms of its success in the opinion polls in particular, without understanding how it has been invidiously compared, how Arroyo was seen as the bad president, now Aquino is the good one. And Aquino, of course, did his best to keep this foil in the forefront by putting Arroyo herself under house arrest, but also impeaching the Supreme Court Chief Justice linked to Arroyo, the ombudsman, and so on. These kind of political vendettas, I should say. Again, that may seem slightly polemical, but think of a place like the Ukraine, where a former prime minister is sitting in jail. All of a sudden, that seemed negatively. The European Union is complaining. Do you see people complaining about Arroyo being in jail? So he's managed to portray this as part of his righteous struggle for good governance, rather than a case of political revenge, simple as that. So that's another example of the success of a narrative, that all of a sudden that's a positive thing. It's not considered petty to be picking on your predecessors, like he's obviously doing. And it also underlines Aquino's basic legitimacy. And I think that's the point. Given the crisis of legitimacy under the Arroyo regime, this has helped legitimate the current one. This is, after all, a president fairly elected, which was not the case in 2004, obviously. Last time a president was fairly elected was 1998, and that president was then very unfairly removed from office. And then we have 1992, also in my opinion, a stolen election. And 1986, we all know what happened then. So basically, actually, the last fairly elected president before Estrada was Marcos in 1965, given the corruption of the 1969 election. So it's actually quite an extraordinary event when a president is fairly elected, it turns out. And so that's one of the keys to Aquino's legitimacy. The fact he's been sticking to his reformist script very studiously. The fact that Arroyo lost any ability to explain herself. As part of this project I'm working on in presidentialism with another political science, July Takanki, we've been trying to actually talk to presidents. And most presidents have been, or former presidents are very accessible. Cory Aquino was quite reluctant to talk, it turns out. She wasn't very interested in talking about her presidency, but ultimately she was willing to discuss things. Arroyo, interestingly, was not. And it's not just that Arroyo was so busy. I think she really seemed to have lost the ability to explain herself. And I think that's telling for a president now who seems to have no difficulty explaining what he's doing, and have no difficulty in convincing people that he's doing the right thing. So I think that is a key to understanding the success of this administration. In Stronach's terms, Pinoy is an orthodox innovator. He's taking this regime narrative He's taking this group of interests, institutions, and innovating within that tradition. He's not really doing anything new. He's innovating within that well-established regime, and he's doing it with people who have been involved in previous regimes in many cases. So it's actually even a core group of top government officials who've been experienced in this because they've served in the Correa administration, the Ramos administration, even sometimes the first half of the Arroyo administration when she was still considered a reformer. You have the backing of strategic groups, as I mentioned, the renewal of a kind of reformist discourse under Ramos, and interestingly, even strong popularity among the poor. This is very significant, I think, although there's signs that this may be weakening. If I might be allowed to offer a brief aside here on the question of corruption, which is, of course, the basis of this kind of narrative. The idea of corruption, though I've already mentioned in passing the difficulties, of course, of actually dealing analytically with this issue. Transparency's International's very weak methodology in doing so. But it's not just a technical issue with a technocratic solution. It's something that has bred anti-corruption campaigns, and it's very much viewed in culturalist terms. And I think to understand the whole anti-corruption narrative in the Philippines, one has to understand how it was politicized in the context of the struggle against Marcos. I mentioned the martyrdom of Ninoy, and also the death of St. Correa. So it has a strong emotional element. So it's not just, well, I will deal with the issue of corruption in a very matter-of-fact way. No, it has a strong, it resonates very strongly, also due to the particular individuals, Ninoy and Correa in particular, who were willing to, make the sacrifices necessary to put this corruption forward, anti-corruption campaign forward. Of course, corruption is very corrosive. When an administration gets to power, it tends to be it's led into temptation, to put it in religious terms. That's seemingly what happened to the Arroyo administration. And sure enough, even though Arroyo starts out as a reformist, she's brought in to replace the corrupt Estrada, that terrible, lazy, middle-class nightmare of a president. And what happens to Arroyo? She herself becomes corrupt. So that leads to the context in which a new reformer can emerge. So I'm basically trying to say that this is, the elite dream come true. A successful president who's got the strong support of the key strategic groups in Philippine society. There's an amount of consensus among these groups that has been rare since the Ramos administration. There's this conviction that he's actually undertaking necessary reforms. The country's image, as I mentioned, is improving. The country has been rebranded. There's just one little problem. The poor don't seem to be benefiting. And I want to talk about that a little more in some detail. A little reduction in poverty. People still remain hopeful among the poor. But this is a very different situation than what happened in Thailand. And if you'll indulge me, I want to make a brief reference to the Thai comparison. I've always thought Thailand is a very interesting comparison for the Philippines. Of course, I'm not the only one to think this. Antoinette Ruquiz's book, which she discussed at the PPA SA conference, comparing the Philippines and Thailand, the political economic perspective, shows the usefulness of this comparison. There's been a number of other scholars who've done this. But in this case, I want to compare the narratives of good governance and populism. So let's think about the comparison here. In a sense, Estrada was the Philippine Thaksin. He was somebody who came along with a pro-poor narrative that was very threatening to the elite. Estrada was never liked, beginning as a senator, then a vice president, and then all of a sudden he gets elected president in 1998, overwhelmingly. He is not seen favorably. And so the anger, the elite and middle class anger toward Thaksin is something very familiar to those of us looking at the Estrada administration. There are, of course, important differences. Estrada was not an organizational man. He never had a strong political party like Thaksin was able to build up. And I think perhaps most significant, he did not create a political movement to support him after he was overthrown. 2006, Thompson's overthrown, but the red shirt movement is created, it's born. And of course, it makes life miserable for all of Thompson's successors, particularly the peace administration after 2008. That did not occur in the Philippines. Arroyo's life was made miserable not by the Estrada supporters, but by our own one-time middle-class allies. Thai yellow shirts, as they're called, the anti-Thaksin movement and the Democrat Party affiliated with them, repeatedly had to resort to extra-constitutional means. So it's as if it wasn't just 2001 and the people power coup against Estrada. They kept continuously having to resort to this because of the power of Thaksin and his red shirts. And in fact, of course, as you know, there were a number of red shirts massacred in Bangkok, in the middle of the capital, just 3 years ago. And we've seen the triumphant return of the red shirts with the election of a pro-Thaksin government led by Thaksin's own sister. So I think it's a very different story than what we see in the Philippines. Reformers have been on the defensive in Thailand. They've been not able to deal with the populist offensive. So in Stronach's kind of terms, we have a populist regime in Thailand, not a reformist one. So, somewhat coincidentally, the Aquino administration and its allies, and of course its predecessors, are known as yellows, just like the yellow shirts in Thailand, it seems. And coincidentally, they're also both reformist in orientation. So why have the Philippine yellows been so successful? Well, they had a stronger narrative from the outset. They had their martyrs, they had their dictator to contrast themselves with, and more recently still, they had Arroyo as the apostate of reform, who could be used as a foil. The importance of strategic groups is very important here. Business, religious, civil society activists, and the military. Strategic groups are somewhat more split in Thailand. There's not a continuous mass movement that's opposed them. There's been no Estrada-based red shirt movement to keep reformists on the run. In fact, of course, Estrada has reconciled to a certain degree with the yellow faction because of the common hatred of Arroyo. And of course, one had a new person to blame everything on. Things could be blamed on Arroyo. And so the yellows, in the Philippine case, were seen to save the day, not to have subverted constitutional processes as in Thailand. Okay, so back to the Philippine case, and I'll just finish up with this. So there's no doubt that there's some significant accomplishments besides what I've already mentioned. Macroeconomic stability is one, and that of course is not really an accomplishment of this administration, but perhaps can be seen as an accomplishment of this reformist regime over the last couple of decades. We shouldn't forget the Philippines was once like Greece in terms of false reports of its from its central bank and so on, being isolated from international finance, economy in a nosedive. All these kind of things that occurred a little over a quarter of a century ago that are now taking place in Greece. Things have changed in the Philippines. It's a very stable macroeconomic picture. It's a booming service economy, as we've already talked about. It's not just the call centers, it's also overseas remittances. Another point, of course, is the growing stateness. It's not that insurgencies have disappeared, but at least they're under control, it seems. They don't seem to be a major threat to the state anymore. Negotiations are ongoing. In certain key centers of the Philippines, such as Davao, the law and order situation has improved, albeit through egregious violations of human rights. Transparency seems to be paying off. One could argue the muckraking during the Arroyo administration is now paying off because now presidents can no longer afford to be so openly corrupt. That had eroded Arroyo's legitimacy. The role of the internet in the Philippines is very interesting. Of course, it's not quite as transgressive in a place like Malaysia, where it's a thorn in the side of the government, or even Singapore. But it's very much involved in monitoring, bringing up corruption scandals, and so on. Freedom of Information Act would also, of course, aid this process further. But the structural problems remain. I want to talk briefly about poverty rates, jobless growth, high unemployment, lagging infrastructure, and the failure to fulfill the promise of inclusive growth. Again, you'll be familiar with this. Despite the boom in call centers, despite the fact that life in the middle class is definitely improving, those who don't find themselves in this middle class are facing still grave obstacles, particularly given the small growth in manufacturing, problems in part-time unemployment, and the actual fall in full-time jobs. As you know, there are a lot of arguments about these statistics, what they really mean, whether they're somewhat misleading and so on. I don't want to get into details, but let's face it, there's been no significant progress on the job front for the poor. Poverty is persistent despite the beefing up of CCT. Again, one could argue it's too early to tell, but it seems to be the same pattern that we've had under the Aurora administration. After all, growth was already high under the Aurora administration. The criticism was it's not inclusive, we're going to be different. 3 years into the Aquino administration, at least in terms of the evidence, it's not there. One could say just be patient and wait till the second half of the administration. So far, we don't see strong signs of progress. One thing that I've mentioned at the outset was I think there is a problem with the infrastructure. I think this administration has been very cautious in infrastructural offensive that it's promised. I think key projects have been canceled due to supposed corruption without, of course, knowing the details of what was involved. Those changes, whether it be in Roro or Laguna, things like that, and without doubt the lag in infrastructural spending slowed growth in 2011. Manufacturing continues to decline in the Philippines, something that I think is very disturbing. There's no sign of reversal of that. There is actually a window of opportunity at the moment. China is now too expensive for some basic manufacturing. This should be a golden opportunity for the Philippines to re-emerge. Instead, it seems to be Burma, Myanmar that's on the forefront. Of course, people will talk about some of the problems in terms of wages, but also in terms of infrastructure that's preventing industry from being revived. My criticism of the current administration is I don't see it as a major priority. I don't see them putting this front and center, saying this is something we really need to emphasize. The other, of course, aspect is the stagnation in the agricultural sector. Problems of rural poverty persist, and of course, very slow progress on agrarian reform, which has been typical of this reformist regime from the beginning. Very limited progress in that regard. Another very interesting indicator is foreign direct investment. Where is the great increase in foreign direct investment? We're getting a lot of hot money inflows, yes, but where is the FDI? Why is it still that Philippines neighbors like Thailand and Vietnam are attracting so much more foreign investment than the Philippines? Even Indonesia is doing business better in that regard. I've listed some of the factors that people give for why FDI has been lagging in the Philippines. But again, something that clearly cannot be seen as an accomplishment in this administration. In fact, in many ways, rather disappointing performance in this regard. The crisis of education. Ongoing, of course, and the question is what could this administration have done more, and they have increased, at least the budget has been increased. The discussion of K-12 is obviously an important step. But if we're talking about improving the plight of the poor, the continuing crisis of education, which keeps many poor Filipinos from being qualified for the kind of service sector jobs that are increasing in the Philippines, in terms of their level of English, in terms of other skills that might lead them into middle-class professions. We've seen all sorts of signs of crisis that the Aquino administration has not been able to cope with. Again, is that a fair criticism? Isn't that something they inherited? Yes. But after 3 years, do we see enough progress in that regard? I leave that as an open-ended question. I realize I'm being somewhat unusually critical and even perhaps unfair, but given how positive the media spin is about this president, I think it's probably appropriate to have at least a somewhat more skeptical view. There are, of course, some unfulfilled promises that also could be used as criticisms. And then, of course, this discussion about how growth is benefiting the very richest in the Philippines, in fact, the top 40 families. That was a big issue, and I think it's worth emphasizing. The country is growing, but for whom? And the throwaway line there, apparently the line originates with a Tondo worker who was telling a Philippine politician that what use is 6.6% growth when ordinary Filipinos are still dependent on 5.6 to maintain their livelihood. But the top 40 families in the Philippines nations are obviously prospering. Perhaps my most polemical slide, an oligarch's dilemma. Structural reform is needed. More inclusive growth has been promised but not yet delivered. The rich need to be taxed more, monopolies need to be broken up, smuggling needs to be stopped. Even his own allies are complaining about that. More comprehensive land reform is necessary. Reindustrialization should be highly prioritized. I would argue this runs against some of the prevailing ideological currents of the administration, which are highly neoliberal. The administration has not followed, in my opinion, closely enough some of the sound advice it's received, for example, on industrialization by the ADB. And of course, the question of Aquino's own interests as a landowner, Aquino's own interests as a member of the oligarchy. Is that also maybe a factor in limiting his actual reform orientation? But without doubt, to conclude, he's put on a good performance. He's defined his presidency in terms of corruption. He's effectively portrayed himself as somebody sincere about combating it. And that leads people to overlook the lack of systematic change. His basic legitimacy, thanks to the fact that he's the only fairly elected president in quite a long time, strong elite support, and the overwhelming sense this president is honest. He's sincere. And as long as that impression is strong, he seems to be able to live off of that and not have to offer too many concrete accomplishments. With such a powerful reformist narrative, Aquino's second term, even then, that looks rather promising in terms of his